Eleanor Vance folded her linen napkin with such quiet precision that the crease could have cut glass. No one at the long mahogany table noticed the action, just as no one had ever noticed the precision of anything she did in this house. The dining room of the Vance estate on Beacon Hill was bathed in the warm, heavy light of a crystal chandelier. It was the height of the autumn shipping season, a time when half the wealth of Boston needed to be fed, flattered, and seated correctly for cargo to move and contracts to be signed. Tonight, 14 guests sat beneath the glittering lights, the air thick with the smell of roasted pheasant and expensive Bordeaux. For 9 years, Eleanor had been the silent architect of this empire. She was wearing her signature high-collar navy silk dress, a garment chosen not to draw attention but to project an image of steady, unremarkable competence. She sat near the foot of the table, her spine perfectly straight, her tired, wide-set hazel eyes tracking every movement in the room. She knew exactly what was required to keep the Vance shipping empire running. She knew that the port commissioner's wife needed to be seated facing the grand double doors because she liked to monitor who came and went. She knew that Arthur's lead, insurance broker, drank too heavily by the third course and needed to be subtly steered toward strong coffee before he started discussing tonnage rates. Eleanor managed these fragile alliances invisibly, building a wall of social and financial security stone by stone, until everyone simply assumed the wall had always been there. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table. He was 36, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit his aristocratic frame flawlessly. He possessed the careless, unconsidered ease of a man who had never once in his life had to wonder whether his place in a room was secure. He was currently speaking to Mr. Hollis, the chief shipping inspector from the customs house, who had come to discuss a delicate discrepancy in the seasonal cargo ledgers. Seated to Arthur's right was his oldest sister, Beatrice. Beatrice wore a deep violet dress, heavy pearl earrings, and an expression of permanent, polished judgment. She had spent the better part of the decade taking the credit for the flawless execution of the Vance estate, treating Eleanor not as a sister-in-law, but as a particularly efficient domestic employee. It was between the fish and the roast courses that the air in the room shifted. Hollis leaned forward, his voice cutting through the ambient clatter of silver against china. The customs house requires a highly specific accounting of the spring manifests. Miss Vance, it's a matter of meticulous record-keeping. I trust your firm is prepared to provide it. Arthur smiled, a confident, easy gesture, and waved his hand dismissively toward the foot of the table. You have nothing to worry about, Hollis. Our internal records are beyond reproach. Evelyn handles the household and the firm's secondary ledgers, and she has a gift for absolute detail. Isn't that right? The table did not stop. No one's fork paused in the air. The low hum of conversation continued exactly as it had been continuing. To the guests, the name was simply a meaningless syllable, gone as soon as it was spoken, replaced a half-second later by the clinking of glasses. But Eleanor went entirely still. Evelyn was Arthur's eldest sister. Evelyn had died of a sudden fever 3 years before Arthur and Eleanor were even married. She had been the one to manage the Vance household before her death, executing the silent, invisible labor that Eleanor now performed. Arthur had not simply misspoken. He had spoken the name of a ghost. He had used a dead woman's name in the exact place where his wife's name belonged, and he had not even paused to correct himself. He had moved on to discussing port tariffs without missing a beat. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, hidden beneath the heavy tablecloth. Her fingernails pressed so fiercely into the soft flesh of her palm that a sharp, crescent-shaped red mark bloomed against her pale skin. She looked up. Across the length of the mahogany table, Beatrice was watching her. The older woman's pale blue eyes glinted in the chandelier light, and a slow, cruel smirk touched the corner of her mouth. Beatrice had heard it. She knew exactly what her brother had just done, and she found it deeply amusing. In that fleeting 11-second window, a profound realization settled into Eleanor's chest like a stone dropped into freezing water. The ripples moved outward, touching every memory of her marriage. She did not occupy a name in this house. She occupied a function. The precise, irreplaceable work she did, the seating charts, the late-night financial auditing, the careful management of every alliance, was labor that Arthur simply attributed to the invisible machinery of his life. To him, there was no Eleanor. There was only the mechanism that kept his shirts pressed, his dinners flawless, and his ledgers balanced. It didn't matter if it was Evelyn or Eleanor or a ghost. Arthur glanced down the table, expecting the usual nod of quiet confirmation from the woman in the navy dress. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not cry. She simply reached for her crystal wine glass, lifted it slightly toward Miss Hollis, and smiled. It was the most dishonest thing she had done in 9 years of marriage. The smile looked exactly like polite agreement, full of perfect, practiced warmth. But beneath the surface, it was entirely made of ice. The dinner would continue for another hour. She would endure the rest of the courses. She would nod. She would direct the servants, and she would ensure Arthur's evening ended in total triumph. But as the red mark throbbed in her palm, Eleanor Vance made a silent promise to the ghost whose name she had just been called. By tomorrow morning, Arthur Vance would learn exactly what happened when the invisible machinery of his life decided to stop working. The dinner concluded precisely at 11, exactly as Eleanor had planned it. She stood in the grand foyer, enveloped in the soft glow of the gas lamps, offering her hand to the departing guests. She thanked the port commissioner's wife for her charming company. She smiled warmly as Miss Hollis, the customs inspector, expressed his deep satisfaction with the evening. Arthur stood beside her, beaming with the particular triumph of a man who believed he had just single-handedly secured his company's future. He smelled faintly of expensive cigars and aged bourbon. Not once did he look at his wife. Not once did he realize that the ghost of his dead sister was still lingering in the cold air between them. Beatrice was the last to leave. She wrapped a heavy velvet cloak over her violet dress, swaying slightly on her heels. The wine had loosened her features, leaving only the sharp, mean edges of her true nature. A lovely dinner, Eleanor, Beatrice murmured, leaning in close enough that Eleanor could smell the sour edge of the vintage Boardroom on her breath. You really do manage the servants so well. One almost forgets you aren't one of them. Eleanor's expression did not change. The faint, crescent-shaped red mark in her palm throbbed, but her face was a mask of flawless, terrifying calm. Good night, Beatrice, she said, her voice completely smooth. Do step carefully on the cobblestones. When the heavy oak doors finally closed, the vast house fell into a profound, ringing silence. Arthur did not linger. He loosened his silk tie, picked up his monogrammed crystal whiskey glass from the silver tray in the hall, and began walking toward his study. Brilliant evening, he muttered, mostly to himself. Hollis is eating out of my hand. Have the staff clear the dining room before morning, will you? He did not wait for an answer. He simply vanished behind the heavy mahogany doors of his study, assuming the house would magically reset itself by dawn. Eleanor stood alone in the foyer for a long time. She listened to the ticking of the towering grandfather clock. She looked at the imported marble floors, the sweeping staircase, the gilded mirrors that reflected a woman in a high-collar navy silk dress. A woman who had spent 9 years making herself invisible so that a weak man could feel tall. She did not go to the master suite. She had not slept in Arthur's room for over 2 years, an arrangement made under the polite fiction of his irregular working hours. Instead, she walked down the long shadowed hallway to her private study. The room was small, austere, and intensely ordered. It was the only space in the vast estate that belonged entirely to her. Eleanor stood before the tall mirror in the corner and reached for the buttons of her navy silk dress. She unfastened them one by one. The fabric slipped from her shoulders and pooled at her feet on the hardwood floor. Stepping out of the dress felt like stepping out of a straitjacket. She left it there, an empty shell of the obedient wife, and walked to her mahogany wardrobe. She dressed quickly and methodically. She chose a tailored charcoal traveling skirt, a crisp white blouse, and a heavy wool coat. It was not the attire of a high society hostess. It was the armor of a woman going to war. She pulled a single, sturdy leather trunk from the top of the closet. She did not throw her clothes into it in a frantic, emotional frenzy. She folded each garment with the exact same precision she had used on the linen napkins at dinner. She packed only what was hers. She left the diamond necklaces, the pearl earrings Arthur had bought her for anniversaries he couldn't remember, and the heavy gold wedding band. She placed the ring gently on the polished surface of her vanity. She did not cry. Tears were a biological response to loss, and Eleanor was rapidly realizing that she was not losing anything of value. The stone in her chest had shattered, and in its place was a cold, expansive clarity. When the trunk was packed, She walked over to her small writing desk. Resting in the center of the blotter was a thick, heavy book. The brass-cornered leather ledger. This was not the public ledger Arthur kept in his office. This was the true architecture of the Vance shipping empire. Inside its pages, written in Eleanor's meticulous, slanting hand, were the real numbers. The delayed cargo manifests. The bloated insurance liabilities caused by Arthur's incompetent partners. But more importantly, the ledger contained the absolute proof of a secret Eleanor had kept hidden for over a year. The Vance empire was drowning in debt. And through a hidden, anonymous trust left to Eleanor by her late mother, Eleanor had quietly purchased every single one of those debts. Arthur thought she was a functionary. He did not know she was his largest creditor. Eleanor traced the cold brass corner of the ledger, feeling the throb of the red mark on her palm. She picked up the heavy book and placed it carefully into the leather trunk, right on top of her folded clothes. Finally, she took a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored estate stationery. She dipped her fountain pen into the black ink and wrote 3 lines. For Arthur, just I have moved to a separate residence. I will not be returning to Beacon Hill. You will hear from my legal counsel regarding the separation of our assets, Eleanor. She did not mention Evelyn. She did not mention the humiliation. Explaining her pain to a man who refused to see her was a waste of ink. She sealed the letter and carried it down the hall, slipping it silently under the door of his study, where the faint smell of whiskey and cigar smoke still lingered. It was 4 a.m. The house was dead quiet. Eleanor picked up the heavy leather trunk. She did not call for a servant. She carried it down the grand staircase herself, her footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian runners. She reached the foyer, unlatched the heavy brass locks of the front door, and pulled it open. The damp, freezing fog of the Boston morning rushed in, smelling of the harbor and the sea. It was bitterly cold, but as the wind hit her face, Eleanor took her first full, deep breath in 9 years. She stepped over the threshold, closing the massive door behind her with a soft, definitive click. She did not look back. The morning sun breached the tall, rain-streaked windows of the Beacon Hill estate, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported marble floors. Arthur Vance woke at 8 o'clock, his head throbbing with a dull ache from the vintage Bordeaux and the heavy bourbon he had consumed the night before. He lay in the vast, silk-sheeted bed of the master suite for a long moment, expecting the familiar rhythm of the house to pull him into the day. The faint clink of fine china, the muffled footsteps of the staff, the sharp scent of dark roasted coffee, perfectly timed to his waking. He dressed slowly, sliding into a fresh charcoal suit, his mind already shifting to the harbor docks and the tonnage reports he needed to review. He walked down the sweeping staircase, entirely unbothered by the heavy silence that seemed to have settled over the mansion. He headed first to his study. There, lying starkly on the dark Persian rug, just inside the door, was a single sheet of cream-colored estate stationery. Arthur picked it up. He recognized Eleanor's precise, slanting handwriting immediately. He read the 3 lines, his heavy brow furrowing in a slow expression of profound annoyance. I have moved to a separate residence. I will not be returning to Beacon Hill. You will hear from my legal counsel regarding the separation of our assets. He stared at the words, waiting for a surge of panic or heartbreak, but felt neither. Instead, he let out a short, dismissive breath, a feminine tantrum. That was all this was. He remembered, vaguely, calling her by his late sister's name during dinner. A minor slip of the tongue, the kind of insignificant error a busy man makes when his mind is occupied with $1,000,000 contracts. And for that, she had packed a bag in the middle of the night to play the martyr. He tossed the letter onto his massive mahogany desk. It landed next to his crystal whiskey glass, which still held a shallow amber puddle from the night before. Ridiculous, he muttered. He assumed she had taken a carriage to a quiet hotel across the city, perhaps hoping he would come chasing after her with apologies and diamonds. She would sit in a cold room for 2 days, realize she had no independent income, and quietly return before the Sunday social calls began. He would simply let her wait. Arthur walked into the dining room for breakfast. The long mahogany table, so perfectly arranged the night before, now looked strangely hollow. The chair at the foot of the table was empty. The silver coffee pot was waiting, but the coffee was a degree too cold. The morning newspaper was resting beside his plate, but it was not folded to the financial section, as it usually was. Small, almost imperceptible failures in the invisible machinery of the house. Before he could summon a servant to complain, The heavy double doors opened, and Beatrice swept into the room. She was dressed for a morning of shopping, wearing a tailored emerald walking suit and a hat adorned with expensive black feathers. She took one look at the empty chair at the foot of the table and offered a cruel, knowing smile. "I see the little ghost has finally floated away," Beatrice said, pulling out a chair and signaling the maid for tea. Arthur picked up his fork, slicing into his eggs with unnecessary force. "She left a melodramatic note in my study. Says she isn't returning. I suppose she's hiding in some boutique hotel, waiting for me to beg." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "Oh, let her pout, Arthur. She always had the disposition of a tired governess. She has no money, no social standing outside of this family, and absolutely no spine. She'll be back by tomorrow evening, begging you not to lock her out of her own wardrobe. But I don't have time for domestic theatrics." Arthur grumbled, sipping his lukewarm coffee. "Hollis is breathing down my neck about the customs inventory, and the winter shipping schedules need to be finalized." "Then let her freeze," Beatrice said dismissively, adding a lump of sugar to her cup. "This house practically runs itself anyway. And frankly, it is exhausting watching her skulk around the corridors like a wounded sparrow." Arthur nodded, satisfied with his sister's assessment. He wiped his mouth, stood up, and adjusted his cuffs. The world was functioning exactly as it should. An hour later, Arthur's carriage arrived at the towering stone building that housed the headquarters of Vance Shipping. He walked through the bustling front office with unconsidered ease of a king serving his court. Clerks bowed their heads. Typewriters clattered in a frantic rhythm. He stepped into his spacious corner office, which overlooked the gray, churning waters of the Boston harbor. He sat behind his desk and rang the silver bell for his head clerk, a nervous, thin man named Mr. Simmons. Arthur commanded, not looking up from his cigar box. "Bring me the reconciled spring ledgers, the ones with the customs inventory. Hollis wants the final numbers by noon." Simmons hesitated, clutching a stack of files to his chest. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously. "Sir, we don't have the final reconciled numbers." Arthur stopped, a cigar halfway to his mouth. "What do you mean you don't have them? They are updated every Friday." "They are, sir?" Simmons stammered, stepping back slightly. "But Mrs. Vance is the one who handles the reconciliation between the public accounts and the secondary accounts. She usually sends the brass, cornered ledger by messenger at 8 o'clock every morning. It hasn't arrived. I assumed she was unwell." A flicker of genuine irritation crossed Arthur's face. The brass, cornered ledger. He had always known Eleanor kept a separate book to track the more delicate financial maneuvers. The delayed payments, the leveraged debts, the quiet loans keeping the company afloat. But he had never actually looked inside it. He had simply trusted that it existed and that she would fix whatever needed fixing, then send a clerk to the house to fetch it. Arthur snapped, lighting his cigar. "I did, sir." Simmons whispered. "The staff said Mrs. Vance took her personal trunk in the night. The ledger is gone." Arthur stared at the clerk through a cloud of thick blue smoke. For the first time that morning, a tiny, icy prick of unease touched the back of his neck, but his ego quickly swallowed it. He was Arthur Vance. He did not need his wife to count his ships. "Fine," Arthur said coldly. "Bring me the raw drafts. I'll do it myself." Simmons scurried out of the room, looking terrified. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair, looking out at the massive freighters in the harbor. He was entirely confident. He had no idea that the gears of his empire had already stopped turning, and that the woman he thought was a mere functionary had just walked away with the only key. 3 weeks passed. 21 days since the brass, cornered ledger walked out the front door of the Beacon Hill estate. At first, the deterioration was subtle, the way a grand ship takes on water long before it begins to list. The silver in the dining room lost its flawless mirror polish. The morning coffee was consistently bitter. The household staff, without Eleanor's quiet, meticulous daily directives, began to operate with a frantic, disjointed energy that left the mansion feeling less like a sanctuary and more like a crowded train station. But the true collapse began in the spaces where the Vance family's social and financial power intersected. It started with the Autumn Harbor Gala. Beatrice, eager to prove that Eleanor was nothing more than an easily replaced domestic functionary, had insisted on hosting the event herself. She swept through the house in her violet gowns, shouting orders at the maids and hastily scribbling a seating chart based entirely on social pedigree rather than strategic alliances. The evening was a catastrophic failure. Without Eleanor's invisible hand, Beatrice seated the harbor commissioner directly across from a rival shipping magnate, currently suing him over dock fees. The tension froze the soup course. Worse, Beatrice had no idea that Mr. Whitcomb, the firm's primary insurance backer, required his wine glass to be subtly watered down after 8 o'clock. Left entirely to his own devices, Whitcomb drank heavily, became belligerent during the roast, and loudly insulted a crucial British investor before passing out in the drawing room. Arthur had stood by the fireplace, watching the British investor summon his carriage early, his face tight with barely suppressed fury. Beatrice had simply laughed it off, blaming the servants for the bad wine. But as Arthur looked at the chaotic, ruined room, a cold, heavy stone of realization dropped into his stomach. The house did not run itself. Now, sitting in his corner office at Vance Shipping, Arthur stared at the sprawling mess of paperwork covering his massive mahogany desk. The raw drafts of the company's financials were spread out before him like a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He unbuttoned his waistcoat, his normally immaculate charcoal suit looking rumpled. The air in the office was thick with cigar smoke and the saw scent of his rising panic. He dragged his finger down a column of numbers, his heart hammering against his ribs. Nothing balanced. The spring manifests showed 3 ships operating at a severe loss, yet the bank accounts from that quarter reflected a massive influx of capital. There were marginal notes written in Eleanor's neat, slanting hand codes, abbreviations, and references to secondary accounts he could not find. Simmons. Arthur shouted, his voice cracking slightly. The thin clerk practically fell through the door, clutching a fresh stack of envelopes to his chest. Yes, Miss Vance. Where's the capital from the May shipments? Arthur demanded, slamming his fist onto the desk. The crystal whiskey glass rattled. The raw drafts show a deficit of $60,000, but we paid the dock fees in full. Where did the money come from to cover it? Simmons swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the floor. I don't know, sir. Mrs. Vance always handled the deficit reconciliation. She kept the routing numbers in the brass-cornered ledger. We never saw the source of the emergency fund, sir. We only saw the balance when she was finished. Arthur stared at the clerk. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sallow, sickly pale. For 9 years, he had believed his company was a titan, an unstoppable engine of wealth. He had stood at the head of his table, drinking fine wine, boasting about his genius to men like Hollis. But looking at the chaotic ink on the pages before him, the brutal truth finally pierced his monumental ego. He was not the engine. He was just the hood ornament. Eleanor had been the engine. She had not just been managing the dinners. She had been quietly moving money, covering his reckless expansions, balancing the ledgers, and keeping the entire Vance empire from sinking into the harbor. And he had thanked her by calling her by the name of a dead woman who had never possessed a fraction of her brilliance. Before Arthur could process the full weight of his own blindness, Simmons stepped forward and hesitantly placed a thick, heavy envelope on the desk. It bore the seal of the First National Bank of Boston. This arrived by special courier, sir. Simmons whispered, it's marked urgent. Arthur snatched the envelope, tearing it open with trembling fingers. He scanned the heavy legal parchment, his breath turning shallow. It was a formal notification of debt consolidation. The massive, leveraged loans Arthur had taken out over the past 3 years. Loans he thought were safely scattered across 5 different lenient creditors had been bought out. Every single note, every outstanding debt that Vance Shipping owed had been aggressively acquired by a single, anonymous holding company called the Golden Lion Trust, and the trust was calling in the debt in full by the end of the month, sir. Simmons asked, watching Arthur grip the edges of the desk to keep his hands from shaking. As it bad news, Arthur did not answer. He looked out the rain-streaked window at his ships bobbing in the harbor. They didn't belong to him anymore. Nothing did, unless he could find the brass-cornered ledger. The company would be seized in less than 30 days. He didn't need a ghost named Evelyn. He needed the wife he had thrown away. Across the city, far from the heavy, suffocating mahogany shadows of Beacon Hill, the morning sun poured through the massive floor to ceiling windows of a newly leased office overlooking the harbor. This space did not smell of stale cigar smoke or old money arrogance. It smelled of fresh espresso, polished glass, and absolute, unrestricted freedom. Eleanor Vance sat behind a sleek, minimalist desk crafted from pale oak. The woman who had folded napkins with invisible precision was gone, left behind like a discarded shell on the floor of her old bedroom. In her place sat the true architect. She wore an emerald green tailored silk suit that fit her with razor-sharp perfection. The color was striking, unapologetic, demanding the eye rather than hiding from it. Her long chestnut hair, once pulled back into a strict, unassuming bun, now fell in soft, confident waves over her shoulders. Small, flawless diamond studs caught the morning light at her ears. She looked expensive. She looked untouchable. The faint red crescent mark on her palm had faded weeks ago, and with it, the last lingering trace of her submission. Sitting across from her was Mr. Ashby, a sharp, discreet attorney who had managed her late mother's private trust for decades. He was looking over a stack of legal documents, his expression a mixture of profound professional respect and mild awe. The consolidation is complete, Eleanor, Ashby said, tapping his gold pen against the file. The Golden Lion Trust now holds 80% of Vance Shipping's leveraged debt. As of yesterday's mail delivery, Arthur has been formally notified. Eleanor did not smile immediately. She rested her hands on the clean surface of her desk. Resting perfectly in the center, framing her new empire, was the brass, cornered leather ledger. Did the banks give him any avenue for extension? She asked, her voice smooth, measured, and stripped of the quiet deference she had used for 9 years. None, Ashby replied, leaning back. Because you own the paper, the banks have no authority to renegotiate. You set the trap perfectly. Over the last 14 months, you used your mother's capital to buy up his bad debts for pennies on the dollar, just as his partners were quietly sinking the firm. He didn't even notice. Arthur doesn't notice anything unless it interrupts his dinner, Eleanor said, tracing the cold brass edge of the ledger. He thought the company ran on his charm. He thought the money magically balanced itself at the end of every month. I let him believe it, Ashby. I built the walls around him so carefully that he forgot what a storm looked like. She opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her meticulous handwriting. It was not a diary of a scorned woman. It was a financial guillotine. He has 30 days to produce the capital, Ashby noted, watching her carefully. He doesn't have it. His liquid assets are tied up in the winter cargo, which hasn't even left the docks yet. What is your final move, Eleanor? Do you force him into bankruptcy? No, Eleanor said softly, the chill in her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Bankruptcy allows a man to play the victim of a volatile market. I am not going to let him blame the ocean for his ruin. I am going to convert the debt into equity. I am going to take his board. Ashby chuckled, a low, dry sound of pure appreciation. A hostile takeover from the ghost in his own house. It's brilliant. But you know he will come looking for you. The moment he realizes the ledger is missing and the debt is called in, he will try to leverage his position as your husband. Let him try. Eleanor said, closing the ledger with a soft, definitive thud. I am no longer the woman who waits for him at the foot of the table. As if summoned by the very mention of his name, the intercom on Eleanor's desk buzzed. Miss Vance, her new assistant, a sharp-eyed young woman named Clara, spoke through the speaker. I apologize for the interruption, but there's a gentleman here demanding to see you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says he is your husband. Ashby raised an eyebrow, gathering his files to leave. Right, on schedule. Eleanor leaned forward, pressing the silver button on the intercom. Her pulse did not flutter. Her breath did not catch. The stone in her chest was gone forever. Does he look upset, Clara? Eleanor asked calmly. He looks like he slept in his suit, ma'am. Clara replied, her tone perfectly professional, but carrying a hint of protective disdain. And he is pacing. Offer him a glass of water. Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with the cold, effortless authority Arthur had always pretended to possess, and let him wait. Exactly 20 minutes. Not a minute less. She released the button and leaned back in her chair, turning her face toward the morning sun pouring in from the harbor. For 9 years, she had been a function, an invisible mechanism, a name spoken incorrectly in a crowded room. Now, she was the owner of the room, and Arthur Vance was about to learn the true cost of making her a ghost. Arthur Vance was not a man accustomed to waiting. For 36 years, the world had reorganized itself around his arrival. Doors were opened before he reached them. Drinks were poured before he asked. Yet for exactly 20 minutes, he sat on a modern leather sofa in the reception area of a sunlit office, watching a young assistant named Clara completely ignore his mounting fury. He checked his silver pocket watch for the 4th time. His charcoal suit, usually immaculate, felt tight and rumpled across his shoulders. The sharp panic of the morning. The missing ledger, the ruined shipping manifests, the looming threat of the Golden Lion Trust. had calcified into a defensive, brittle anger. At precisely the 20-minute mark, Clara looked up from her typewriter. "Miss Vance will see you now." Arthur stood, buttoning his jacket with a sharp, aggressive tug. He intended to march into the room, demand the ledger, and put an end to this absurd, theatrical rebellion. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped into the office. The words died in his throat. The woman seated behind the pale oak desk was not the ghost he had left at the dining table 3 weeks ago. The high-collar, invisible navy dress was gone. In its place was a striking emerald green silk suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the room. Her chestnut hair fell in confident, polished waves. Diamond studs rested at her ears, catching the sun. She did not stand to greet him. She did not look away. She simply sat there, radiating an expensive, untouchable stillness that made the breath catch in Arthur's chest. Resting perfectly in the center of her immaculate desk was the brass, cornered leather ledger. "You kept me waiting," Arthur said, though his voice lacked the booming authority he had intended. It sounded thin, stripped of its usual resonance in the bright, modern room. "You were early," Eleanor replied, her tone perfectly smooth, unbothered by his presence. "And I was working." "Sit down, Arthur." It was a command spoken with the exact cadence he used on his own clerks. Arthur stiffened, refusing to take the chair across from her. Instead, he walked to the desk and planted his hands firmly on the edge, leaning over in an attempt to physically dominate the space. I am not here to play games, Eleanor," he said, his eyes darting to the heavy book resting between her perfectly manicured hands. "You have had your tantrum. You have made your point, but you took company property when you left. I need that ledger. Simmons is useless, Hollis is threatening to find the fleet, and the entire spring inventory is a disaster without your reconciliation." Eleanor did not flinch. She did not lean back. She met his gaze with a terrifyingly calm expression. "The ledger is not company property," she said quietly. "It is my personal property. It contains my private calculations, my personal shorthand, and my intellectual labor. Your firm never paid me a salary, Arthur. Therefore, the work I did belongs entirely to me." Arthur scoffed, a desperate, mocking sound. "Your labor. You are my wife, the house, the clothes on your back, the food you eat. It is all paid for by Vance Shipping, and right now Vance Shipping is under attack." He pulled back, running a hand through his graying hair. The polished veneer of the Boston aristocrat was cracking, revealing the terrified boy underneath. "We received a notice this morning," Arthur continued, his voice dropping slightly, exposing his vulnerability. "A holding company called the Golden Lion Trust bought up our leveraged debt. All of it. They are calling it in by the end of the month. If I do not have those ledgers to untangle the secondary accounts, I cannot secure an extension. The firm will go under." He looked at her, expecting the obedient woman, who had spent 9 years solving his problems, to immediately reach for a pen. He expected her to panic for him. Instead, Eleanor reached out and let her fingertips trace the cold brass corner of the ledger. Her pulse was remarkably steady. "That sounds like a catastrophic failure of management," Eleanor said. Arthur froze. "What?" I said. "It sounds like a failure of management," she repeated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow filled the entire room. "A competent CEO would have known his debts were being bought. A competent CEO would know how to read his own raw drafts. But you are not a competent CEO, Arthur. You are just a man who wore nice suits while I built the walls that kept the water out. How dare you?" Arthur breathed, his face flushing dark red. I dared because you forced me to," Eleanor said, finally standing up. The movement was so graceful, yet so commanding, that Arthur instinctively took a step back. "You stood at the head of a table I arranged, drinking wine I selected, entertaining men I researched. And you called me by the name of a dead woman. You proved in front of a room full of people that my 9 years of flawless devotion meant absolutely nothing." "It was a slip of the tongue," Arthur argued, his voice cracking. "Evelyn used to do the books. It was a harmless mistake." "Evelyn is dead," Eleanor stated, her hazel eyes completely devoid of warmth. "And the wife who tolerated being called by her name is also dead. You came here looking for a mechanism to fix your company. But the mechanism is broken, Arthur. I am no longer your functionary." "Eleanor, please." "The door is behind you," she said, cutting him off with the precision of a guillotine. "I suggest you return to your office and prepare for your board meeting. I hear hostile takeovers are quite unpleasant when you don't know the math." Arthur stood in the center of the sunlit room, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He looked at the woman in the emerald suit, realizing with a sudden devastating clarity that he could not bully her, he could not charm her, and he absolutely could not survive without her. Without another word, the head of the Vance empire turned and walked out of the room looking very much like a man walking to his own execution. The executive boardroom of Vance Shipping was a monument to old money and unearned confidence. Dark mahogany paneling lined the walls, and oil portraits of Arthur's ancestors stared down from the heavy gold frames. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the air in the room was entirely devoid of arrogance. It smelled of cold sweat and impending ruin. 12 board members sat around the massive oval table, their faces grim. Among them was Miss Whitcomb, the heavy-set insurance broker whose drinking Eleanor had managed for years. Today, Whitcomb was completely sober, his hands trembling as he stared at the financial summaries placed before him. At the head of the table, Arthur Vance looked like a man who had not slept in days. His usually immaculate charcoal suit hung loosely on his shoulders. The unconsidered ease that had defined his entire life was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, hollow panic. Seated to his right was Beatrice. Even in the face of corporate disaster, she clung to her elitist armor, wearing a stiff black dress and her signature heavy pearl necklace. She tapped her fingernails impatiently on the polished wood, annoyed that her morning had been interrupted by something as vulgar as a financial crisis. The situation is unprecedented, Arthur said, his voice straining to fill the large room. The Golden Lion Trust has aggressively acquired 80% of our leveraged debt. They are demanding immediate repayment. Without the reconciled spring ledgers to untangle our secondary assets, we cannot secure a bridge loan from the federal banks. Whitcomb slammed his hand onto the table. You told us the firm was liquid, Arthur! You told us the winter cargo would cover the margins. Who the hell is this Golden Lion Trust, and why didn't you know they were buying our paper? We are investigating their identity. Arthur lied smoothly, pulling at his collar. I just need a few more weeks to stabilize them. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. The heavy hinges did not squeak, but the sound of the latch clicking echoed like a gunshot. The frantic murmuring around the table died instantly. Eleanor Vance walked into the room. She did not look like the quiet, invisible wife who had sat at the foot of their dinner tables. She wore the emerald green tailored silk suit, moving with a predatory, effortless grace. The diamond studs at her ears flashed under the chandelier light. In her hands, she carried the brass cornered leather ledger. Trailing a half step behind her was Mrs. Ashby, carrying a sleek black briefcase. Beatrice stood up immediately, her face flushing with indignant rage. What is the meaning of this? Eleanor, this is a closed emergency meeting for shareholders and board members. Have you completely lost your mind? If you have come to beg Arthur to restore your allowance, you will have to wait in the hall like the rest of the domestic help. Eleanor did not even look at Beatrice. She walked slowly down the length of the room, her sharp heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The silence in the room deepened with every step she took. Arthur stared at her, his jaw slack, his eyes fixed on the heavy book in her hands. Eleanor reached the center of the long table. She stopped, looked around at the 12 men who had benefited from her invisible labor for nearly a decade, and finally locked eyes with her husband. She placed the brass cornered ledger onto the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, final thud. Ashby. Eleanor said calmly, never taking her eyes off Arthur. Please inform the board of your capacity here today. Ashby stepped forward, unlatching his briefcase. Gentlemen, I am the senior legal counsel representing the Golden Lion Trust. I am here to formally execute the terms of the defaulted debt. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Whitcomb turned entirely pale. Beatrice gripped her pearls, her eyes darting frantically between her brother and the lawyer. Arthur's voice barely worked. You are their lawyer. He is... Eleanor interrupted, her voice ringing clear and cold as ice. And I am the sole trustee and owner of the Golden Lion. You were looking for the entity that bought your company. Arthur, you are looking at her. Beatrice let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. That is absurd. You are a penniless little mouse who managed the kitchen staff. You don't have the capital to buy a tugboat, let alone the Vance debt. Eleanor finally turned her gaze to Beatrice. The older woman instinctively shrank back under the crushing weight of Eleanor's cold authority. My mother left a private trust in my name, Beatrice, Eleanor said softly, exposing the truth with absolute precision. For 9 years, I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I was too busy keeping this firm from drowning in Arthur's incompetence. But 14 months ago, when Arthur leveraged the winter fleet against a phantom projection, I realized this empire was going to collapse. So I started buying the debt quietly for pennies, using the exact routing numbers recorded in this very ledger. She placed her hand flat on the brass-cornered book. You did this to ruin me, Arthur whispered, his eyes wide with horror. You planned this since the dinner. No, Arthur, Eleanor replied, her voice dropping to a devastating whisper. I planned this over 9 years of fixing your mistakes. The dinner was simply the night I decided to stop protecting you from yourself. Eleanor turned to the board. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Vance Shipping has defaulted on its repayment terms to the Golden Lion Trust, Eleanor announced, her tone shifting to pure corporate dominance. Under the stipulations of the contracts Arthur so carelessly signed, I am exercising my right to convert the outstanding debt into equity. I now own 65% of the voting shares of this company. The room erupted. Men were shouting, pushing their chairs back, looking to Arthur for a defense that he could not provide. He just stood there, completely hollowed out, staring at the wife he had thrown away. Eleanor raised a single hand. The room fell instantly silent. She had commanded the room without raising her voice, achieving in 10 seconds what Arthur had tried to fake for a lifetime. She walked slowly toward the head of the table. Arthur, entirely defeated, stepped aside. Eleanor Vance pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the table, the seat of absolute power, and sat down. She folded her hands over the brass-cornered ledger, looked at the terrified faces of the men before her, and offered a perfectly cold smile. No, Eleanor said. Let us call this meeting to order. The hostile takeover took less than 40 minutes. Eleanor Vance did not raise her voice once. She did not gloat. She simply moved through the agenda with the cold, mechanical precision of a surgeon operating on a dying patient. She formally removed Arthur from the position of chief executive officer, pending an interim replacement appointed by the Golden Lion Trust. She dissolved the excessive vanity budgets, which immediately severed the massive trust allowances Beatrice relied upon to fund her high society lifestyle. Beatrice had not stayed to watch the end. The older woman had fled the boardroom in tears of absolute humiliation, her heavy pearl necklace rattling against her chest. Realizing she was no longer the matriarch of Boston's elite, but merely a dependent of the woman she had treated like a servant. One by one, the defeated board members gathered their useless files and filed out of the room, their heads bowed. They did not look at Arthur. Finally, the heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving only 2 people in the vast, quiet boardroom. Arthur stood near the floor, 2 ceiling windows looking out at the gray, churning waters of the harbor. The ships anchored in the distance, flying the Vance flag, no longer belonged to him. The charcoal suit that had once looked like armor now hung on his frame like a shroud. He looked 10 years older. The unconsidered ease of his youth entirely evaporated. Eleanor remained seated at the head of the table. She calmly unlatched Miss Ashby's briefcase and placed the brass-cornered leather ledger inside, the final piece of her long, silent war. Is there nothing left? Arthur asked. His voice was hollow, barely scraping the silence of the room. He turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. 9 years, Eleanor. We were married for 9 years. There must be something left of us. Eleanor snapped the briefcase shut. The sound was sharp and definitive. I gave you 9 years of flawless devotion, Arthur, she said, her voice perfectly level. I managed your temper, your business partners, your debts, and your reputation, and you rewarded me by treating me like a piece of furniture you occasionally bumped into. Arthur took a slow, heavy step toward the table. The arrogant titan of industry was gone. In his place was a broken man finally grasping the monumental scale of his own foolishness. I was blind, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. I was arrogant and I was a fool. But I see you now, Eleanor. I see everything you did. Every sacrifice, every late night with those ledgers. I will step down without a fight. I will sign whatever Ashby puts in front of me. We can start over. Let me make it right. Just please, don't leave me with nothing. Eleanor stood up. She picked up the briefcase, her emerald green silk suit catching the light of the crystal chandelier above them. She looked at the man she had once promised to love, and she felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering desire, just the clean, expansive piece of the truth. You aren't seeing me, Arthur, Eleanor said softly. You are seeing the power you lost. You aren't apologizing because you broke my heart. You are apologizing because I broke your empire. An apology born from defeat isn't remorse. It's just survival. Arthur flinched, as if she had struck him. He reached out a trembling hand, hovering over the polished mahogany, but he did not dare touch her. The house on Beacon Hill is yours, Eleanor added, her tone turning purely transactional. I have no use for a museum of ghosts. You can sit at the head of the long table, and you can drink your expensive wine, and you can pretend you are still the king of the harbor. She turned away from him and began to walk toward the heavy double doors. Her sharp heels clicked rhythmically against the floorboards. Eleanor! Arthur choked out, speaking her actual name, his voice thick with a devastation he would carry for the rest of his life. Elena, please. She paused at the door. Her hand rested on the brass handle. She did not turn around. You learned my name too late. Arthur. Eleanor pushed the door open and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway. She did not look back. She walked toward the elevator, the heavy brass, cornered ledger safe by her side, leaving the ruined man standing alone in the silence of the empire she now owned.